Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. We're just giving it another minute or two to welcome all of our guests this evening. I'm Doug Farley, the director at the Cobblestone Museum. A little housekeeping, we ask you to remain muted throughout the entire presentation as our speaker, Jennifer Downs, is going to be presenting her information. At the end, the very end of the evening, we'll allow you to unmute your microphone and interact with Jennifer at the end of the evening. But for everyone's enjoyment of the program, we ask you to keep your microphone muted. We are also recording this presentation so that a recording will be available. If you'd like to view the recording after the presentation, just let us know and we'll send you a link. And if you'd like to turn off your video camera, you're welcome to do that. It's up to you. You're completely welcome to leave your camera running or turn your camera off, whichever you prefer. So without too much further ado, I'm going to introduce our museum team. Sue Bonafini, our assistant director, is here. She's going to be introducing our speaker. And Brenda Radzinski is here. She's our quilting expert from the Cobblestone Museum. We're glad to have Brenda with us as well. So Sue, if you would offer your opening remarks and introduce our speaker.
Yes, thank you, Doug. Good evening, everyone. I'm just thrilled to announce that tonight's program about Elizabeth Roseberry Mitchell's graveyard quilt has attracted a record-breaking virtual audience for us. Tonight, there are people on the call from 22 different states that run the various time zones, and 74 registrations have been accepted. We thank you for your generous support of the Cobblestone Society and Museum. We truly appreciate registration donations at all levels, especially if you chose an option that provides greater funding, or if you've previously viewed one or more of our programs since they began in 2021 on a virtual Zoom platform, and maybe you're here with us again. So welcome. Tonight's program is sponsored by Country Treasures Quilt Shop in Brockport, New York. Owner Marie Bell is unable to join us tonight, but I have personally thanked her for supporting our quilt-related programming throughout the years. As stated, tonight's program is being recorded, so if anyone you know who was unable to join us this evening would like to register for a view of the recording, that will be done in the same fashion that you all registered for this live presentation. But because you are already a registrant, you can just ask Doug and he'll be happy to send you the link. Now, for those of you who are new and newly acquainted with us, the Cobblestone Museum is located in the hamlet of Childs in Orleans County, New York, about halfway between Rochester and Buffalo. We welcome visitors to our campus May through October to take guided tours of our 8 campus buildings, which include our 3 cobblestone National Historic Landmark structures. We have 2 additional buildings that are self-guided exhibit areas, and they are related to tonight's topic. One is a 19th century coverlet display of over 20 woven historic textiles. And the second is a Victorian mourning art and sundries exhibit, which displays over 200 examples of objects and images on loan from retired museum curator and director Bill Lattin from his private collection. Tonight, as Doug said, Brenda Radzinski is one of our trustees on the board. She's an avid quilter, and she'll be monitoring the chat box this evening. Our speaker will happily answer your questions after her presentation, and you can use the chat box and type in your questions at any point throughout the program, but she will answer your questions after she's finished. Now, if you're someone who has struggles with using technology and maybe the chat box isn't for you, as Doug pointed out, you can unmute your microphone at the end of the presentation when directed, and you can just ask your question or share a comment. Tonight's speaker Jennifer Downs, is curator at the Kentucky Historical Society. She holds a Bachelor of Arts degree in art history from the University of Kentucky and a Master of Arts degree in the history of decorative arts from the Cooper Hewitt Smithsonian Design Museum, Parsons School of Design. She has held curatorial positions at museums that include the Speed Art Museum in Louisville, Kentucky, the Bonnet House Museum and Gardens in Fort Lauderdale, Florida, and the Art Institute of Chicago. She has also consulted on several research and curatorial projects that are rooted in Kentucky's diverse history. Her special interests include archival research, 19th and 20th century American decorative arts and material culture, and historic interiors. So it is my great pleasure to welcome you, Jennifer. Welcome to you. So you can now share your presentation titled Stitching, Sorrow, and Loss.
Thank you, Sue, for that really lovely introduction, and good evening to everyone. I want to thank you, Sue and Doug, and the Cobblestone Museum for inviting me to speak with you this evening. It's really my pleasure to support your institution, which so clearly values and supports historic preservation, education, community engagement, and the arts. I'm delighted to join you virtually from Kentucky to share the history of a remarkable textile in the Kentucky Historical Society's collection, placing it within the context of 19th century quilt making and mourning customs. I really must admit I was not familiar with the Cobblestone Museum prior to my conversations with Sue, but after a bit of Googling and reading about your institution and foundation, I absolutely resonated with something that I heard on a video on your website and how it relates to my talk tonight. Your museum embraces the phrase, "the past is people," which is a tenet that we hold dear as well at the Kentucky Historical Society, where we endeavor to collect and preserve Kentucky stories through objects and artifacts that not only tell the story of our remarkable state established in 1792, but also its determined and resilient people. And I understand there might be a few Kentuckians in the audience tonight. So besides our horses and bourbon, we treasure a rich history of quilt making as well, a tradition that really has united all of us across time and place. An extraordinary quilt in the Kentucky Historical Society's collection, made by Elizabeth Roseberry Mitchell around 1843, is widely known as the graveyard quilt. This quilt, which is made of cotton and paper and measures about 85 by 81 inches, came into our collection in 1959 when it was donated by the maker's granddaughter, Nina Aura Mitchell Biggs. It really enjoys celebrity status in Kentucky and in quilt making, quilt collecting, and academic circles around the world. Yet because of its rarity and extremely fragile condition, which we go to great lengths to preserve, it is rarely placed on view for extended periods of time. Mitchell, who moved with her family from Pennsylvania to Ohio and then to Kentucky about 1840, designed and created this quilt with the assistance of her two daughters, Sarah and Elizabeth, to memorialize the deaths and future deaths of her beloved family members. So I like to say that this quilt is at once both a striking work of art and a traceable family tree. It's characterized by an overall pattern of alternating Lemoyne stars and brown calico blocks surrounding a cemetery bordered by a picket fence, trellis, and climbing roses. Most unusual for 19th century mourning quilts, which I will talk about this evening, is the presence of coffins, both in the cemetery and around the perimeter of the quilt. And according to family history, it was Mitchell's intention to place a coffin, each sewn with a paper tag identifying a family member, within the central cemetery section when they died. She or her daughters also incorporated additional coffins with the intent of adding the names of new family members as they arrived. Do I see here? While an acute focus on death may seem unimaginable and morbid to us in the 21st century, it was a result of an all too real fact of life in the first half of the 19th century, when life expectancy was, according to many sources, a short 38 to 44 years, and many children died at birth or before their first birthday. And infant mortality and alarming 19th century death rates indicate that death, whether sudden, expected, or unexpected, was a common occurrence in everyday life. People lived with that expectation and apprehension of death each day. And death during childbirth and severe epidemics of cholera, lack of modern medicine, etc., were devastating to families. And the death rate for young children under 10 is thought to have been almost 1/3. Imagery and symbolism pointing to bereavement found its way into the material culture of the period as well. And pictures such as this American watercolor on silk in the Metropolitan Museum of Art's collection, created in 1810, illustrates an often seen formula with children weeping beside a funeral urn with weeping willow trees in the background. This type of memorial was also often made by young women of privilege with significant leisure time or within female formal academies where they received instruction. And I'm going to get a little bit more into the symbology of mourning customs this evening, just a little bit. This type of memorial picture was created primarily in New England between about 1800 and 1840, made by primarily young women who may have learned this type of remembrance art in formal academies or a seminary. The young artist in the watercolor on the right may indeed be pictured here in the familiar composition next to a weeping willow tree, monument, and funereal urn. And the inscription on the monument reads, "Passing stranger, stop and see, thy form must soon lie low with me. Love thy neighbor as thyself, be kind to the poor and fatherless. Trust in God, believe in Christ, that you may have eternal rest." The title of the picture, "The Orphans," placed beneath the monument, suggests that these children have lost their parents. And the image on your left is a detail of a memorial quilt created about the same time in the collection of the International Quilt Museum, which features an inscription on a pedestal surrounded by pink flowers. So a romanticized, really a cult of memory, if you will, flourished, and elaborate mourning customs and rituals could last months beyond the funeral and burial. And these practices were deeply tied to Victorian social behavior, and proper displays of emotion and grief and etiquette were explicitly outlined in etiquette books. Bereaved families memorialized their deceased loved ones in various personal ways. And while mourning customs were developed by the time that Queen Victoria ascended to the British throne in 1837, the fervor of mourning customs and rituals really reached a fever pitch around the time of the American Civil War and the death of Prince Albert in 1861, for whom Queen Victoria mourned for the remaining 40 years of her life, allegedly. And while most women did not have the position and wealth and power to outwardly mourn their loved ones in such extravagant ways, they did express their grief both in intimate ways and also outwardly personalized and expressive ways. Women were viewed at this time as more pious than men and were therefore thought to be the principal mourners in their communities. And in an article by quilt scholar Gail Andrews Treschel, this article is entitled "Mourning Quilts in America," she quotes a woman at the end of the 19th century who remarked that, and I quote, "The custom of mourning presses far more heavily on women than men. In fact, so trifling are the alterations made in a man's dress that practically the whole burden of mourning wrappings seem to have fallen on women. The men positively managed to mourn by proxy. Symbolic customs and imagery included the black mourning dress. Going to go back here. Included the black mourning dress and the symbols of life after death. And a striking picture in the Kentucky Historical Society's collection, which I show you here on the left, made from hand-cut paper, was created in memory of W.H. Link, who was a corporal in the Union Army, serving Company E of the 23rd Kentucky Regiment Volunteer Infantry. And Link was killed in 1862 at the age of 17 at the Battle of Stones River, which resulted in numerous casualties. Link was born in Ohio, we know, but lived in Campbell County, Kentucky as early as 1855. He was listed as a rope maker in the 1860 census and is buried in Murfreesboro, Tennessee. The maker of this memorial incorporated typical imagery that pointed to death and bereavement during this time, including the lilies of the valley, a willow tree, which was the symbol of sorrow and mourning, and an urn atop a monument. An urn was a symbol of Greek mourning and also a vessel for the soul. Fashionable hair art was often based on patterns published in ladies' magazines and instructional books, and was made primarily by women to mourn and memorialize deceased loved ones. Imbued with memory, strands of hair were braided, curled, and twisted with wire to construct elaborate designs that were further embellished with buttons, seeds, flowers, and ribbon. And the practice of making art, jewelry, wreaths, and keepsakes from human hair really reached its popularity in the United States during the Victorian era, 1837 to 1901, particularly around the time, again, of the Civil War. And I show you here 3 elaborate examples of 19th century hair art. The framed hair wreath on your left is comprised of twists and curls, flowers and stems, all made from varying shades of brown hair from 16 different members of the family of George and Elizabeth Cardwell of Shelby County, Kentucky in the 19th century. The elaborate earrings on your top right are made of human hair and gold fittings, and the ring, made in the first decade of the 19th century, belonged to Judge John Rowan and is said to contain the hair of Dr. James Chambers, who Rowan challenged to a duel. Chambers died as a result of his wounds, and according to family history, his hair was collected and incorporated into the design of this ring. The apprehension of death during the 19th century was not reserved for adults and was by necessity accepted as a reality of life. Children's toys included coffins and figures, included this incredibly morbid carved example by today's standards, certainly, in the collection of Winter Museum and Gardens, made between about 1790 and 1850. And the heart-shaped inlay, in my opinion, adds a lighthearted element to an otherwise, dare I say, creepy object. According to Gail Andrews Trushell, again, the 1830s brought about a so-called cult of true womanhood or cult of domesticity. Individuals romanticized death and defined separate spheres for men and women. No longer a helper to men, really to the extent that she was in the 18th century. She was all but removed from the world of commerce and was encouraged to pursue, quote, indoor pursuits which would harmonize with her natural love of home and its duties, according to 19th century publications such as Godey's Lady's Book. Woman's role was seen to preserve home and hearth, and in the early 19th century, in Kentucky and elsewhere, privileged young white women and girls of means practiced their needlework skills in formal academies and made samplers to showcase their practice and accomplishments, as well as their piety. Verses that pointed to fleeting existence and death indicate that mortality and immortality were top of mind. So here I show you on the left a sampler by Indiana-born Eleanor Reeve. She was 9 years old when she created this sampler. She was sent to Louisville, Kentucky for her education. And her sampler features the familiar urns, flowers, and vines that we see in mourning art, and an embroidered verse that reads, I long to see the time when immortal I shall be, to shout and praise my Savior through vast eternity. Likewise, Sarah Bell Brent of Bourbon County, Kentucky, was also 9 years old when she embroidered the sampler on your right. Beneath the typical alphabet that we see on many samplers, she stitched the following verse. Religion should our thoughts engage amidst our youthful bloom. 'Twill fit us for declining age and for the awful tomb. Mrs. Todd. And Mrs. Todd, according to our records, was the wife of teacher Reverend John Todd, a teacher who also opened a female academy in 1830 in Kentucky. Sarah, therefore, may have received private education, instruction, or perhaps learned in an informal girls' school setting. So I think today when we think of quilts, we think of comfort and warmth. Certainly they symbolize comfort and warmth. And quilts have for centuries been inextricably connected to women, memory, community, and tradition. Women have made quilts both by themselves and with other women for utilitarian as well as commemorative purposes. They represent historical moments across time and geographic place. Not only have quilts been made for practical and utilitarian reasons, but they've also been made to, again, commemorate life events and occasions such as births and marriages. For example, the biblically referenced Rose of Sharon was a favorite design motif in Kentucky between about 1840 and 1860 and was commonly used as a wedding quilt pattern. This quilt that I show you here in the Kentucky Historical Society's collection is made of 16 blocks of white cotton embroidered with vivid red and green applique flowers. And it was pieced by Eliza Ann Rainey of Lebanon, Kentucky, around 1843 when she was a teenager. Eliza attended St. Catherine Academy in Washington County, Kentucky, where she learned to sew and embroider. And according to family history, the actual quilting of this textile was completed by women who were enslaved by the family. And while enslaved women were prohibited from receiving formal education, they likely learned fine needlework skills from the many women in their lives, including perhaps their mothers, grandmothers, or others. Quilts were also made to honor community leaders and friends, and as we'll talk about tonight, to memorialize the dead. We might imagine that quilting a tangible memorial to a deceased loved one might assist in an intentional grieving process, stitch by stitch, and bring together a community of women to help one another heal after the unimaginable loss of a loved one. Mourning and memorial quilts were passed down, but were also used in the home, again, for practical purposes, or even in the burial process. The blue and white quilt on your left was made by Nancy Ward Butler to commemorate the death of her granddaughter and namesake, Nancy Adelaide Butler, who died in Jamestown, New York in 1842 of scarlet fever, which was a serious and often fatal childhood disease at this time. This quilt is in the collection of the National Museum of American History, and it's called the Tombstone Quilt, and is really unusual in that the stark design focuses primarily upon the incredibly bold applique letters surrounded by a sawtooth border. It does, on this slide, look like a red, white, and blue quilt, but the red is simply the backdrop. The quilt is really just characterized with this bright white and beautiful cobalt blue fabric. According to the museum's catalog record, the maker of this quilt, Nancy Ward, was born in 1779 and was the daughter of Josiah Ward, and she married James Butler in 1802, and they soon settled in Chautauqua County, New York, and raised their family of 9 children near, and I hope I pronounce this correctly, Leona, New York. So memorial quilts and mourning quilts were also created in the celebrated and distinctive album quilt style, famously made in Baltimore between about 1846 and 1852. And in keeping with this tradition, which is characterized by appliqued blocks of brightly colored symbols, themes, botanicals, abstract designs, etc., that were signed by each maker and typically made by several women and then pieced together. The Eli Lilly family album quilt was made in this tradition by Eli Lilly's family at the time of his death in 1847. And according to family history, his family really set to task the making of this quilt during his last and final illness. The blocks are signed by 9 of his 11 children and their spouses, and apparently several friends also signed the quilt. And the block featuring a lyre, which is sort of diagonally down to your left from the central medallion, that lyre symbol, which is often associated with death, that block was signed by Lilly himself. So not only did the quilt survive as a testament to the family at a time of mourning, but as a memory of the time perhaps that they shared together in anticipation of this forthcoming death of a loved one. And the family really probably bonded together over the making of the quilt at this tenuous and no doubt difficult time of grief and apprehension. Memorial quilts also incorporated one's memories and were often made from remnants of the deceased's clothing and mourning ribbons. Later in the 19th century, creative ways to memorialize one's deceased loved ones found their way into artistic so-called crazy quilts, such as the example shown here from the Kentucky Historical Society's collection. It was made by Anna Marie Schmidt Steinbach, and her parents were German immigrants who moved to New York City, from New York City to Louisville, Kentucky around 1870. Anna married in 1890, and her husband, Edmund Steinbach, who was also from Germany, operated a men's tailoring shop on Market Street in Louisville. And Anna not only worked as a seamstress in his shop, but she was also an accomplished quilt maker. She created this crazy quilt the year of her wedding, 1890, but she was also an accomplished quilt, because she was an accomplished quilt maker, she was able to envision this creation. And in addition to whimsical elements, such as, hopefully maybe you can see here some of those in the slide, a spider web, a horseshoe, what looks to be a hot air balloon, and the alphabet, Anna incorporated the names of her family members and embroidered angels, memorialized 3 siblings who died in infancy. And you can see on the detail, in the detail on your left, that the angels accompany the names of Henry and George. Elizabeth Roseberry Mitchell's graveyard quilt is perhaps one of the most famous of all memorial quilts. Elizabeth's story begins in Greene County, Pennsylvania. In 1834, she and her husband Shadrach moved from their family to Antioch, Ohio. And during this move, they had the first 7 of their 11 children with them. It was here in Ohio in 1836 that she lost her 2-year-old son, John Vanetta Mitchell, and it was here that she conceived the idea for her memorial quilt and began to create a quilt top. And this separate top, which is seen as a study or beginning pattern for the Kentucky Historical Society finished graveyard quilt, is now in the collection of the Highlands Museum in Ashland, Kentucky. In 1840, the family then moved on to Lewis County, Kentucky, which is bounded by the Ohio River on the north. And you can see in the map slide where the point of the arrow ends. That's sort of a roundabout location where the Mitchell family settled on the Ohio River. Shadrach, Elizabeth's husband, was a shopkeeper, a tavern owner, and a farmer, and he purchased a new plot of land that promised to be more fertile and productive than the rocky terrain the family had left behind. The conveyed deed indicates that Shadrach purchased, and I quote, a certain tract of parcel of land containing 310 acres, situated, lying, and being in the county of Lewis and state of Kentucky, and bounded beginning at a chestnut oak, chestnut, and 3 dogwoods to the honey locust and elm, and at the beach below a small ravine, being both upon the river, together all and singular the appurtenances thereunto belonging, or in any way appertaining. I love the fact that before the days of modern surveyances that they were using sort of landmarks such as the oak tree and the chestnut tree. According to family history, the growing family lived in a log structure facing the river. And as a merchant, Shadrach's proximity to the river and the steamboat trade, which was just busting at the seams in Kentucky at this time, that would have been advantageous to him. Because that nearby Maysville, Kentucky, which was really a commercial and cultural crossroads at this time, was really rapidly expanding. And it was here from Maysville that goods were traversed down into the center of the state via hazardous wagon roads, etc. So in the 1830s, Kentucky's population, as I said, was rapidly expanding. The economy was based upon agriculture, and Kentuckians really could produce most of their own food and goods, including animals, grain, hemp, and bourbon, which they also exported. Kentucky was really on the edge of the frontier at this time, but urban areas such as Lexington were starting to really grow and explode, and really Lexington was called the Athens of the West. This could be a whole different lecture, but Kentucky was at this time a very diverse state, both racially, economically, etc. So they could grow, Kentuckians could really grow and produce most of what they needed, but fine cloth and dishes were also imported from the East Coast and from New Orleans. And about a quarter of Kentucky's population in 1830 were enslaved African Americans. And that steamboat trade that I mentioned along the Ohio River moved both goods and people, both enslaved and free, down the Ohio River and Mississippi rivers to New Orleans. So according to Linda Otto Lipset, who chronicles the Mitchell family in her book entitled Elizabeth Roseberry Mitchell's Graveyard Quilt, an American Pioneer Saga, the Mitchell's family's land was initially productive, but the family soon fell victim to unforgiving droughts, failing crops, and mounting debts. In 1842, Elizabeth and Shadrach's son Matthias, whom they called Bub, who had also remained in Ohio, died at the age of 19. We might imagine that this was a time of unimaginable hardship for the family, and upon Matthias's death, the couple made a return visit to Ohio, and according to family history, she was so overwhelmed with grief over the death of her 2 sons who were buried in Ohio that she began to complete the graveyard quilt in earnest. According to the donor of the quilt, Elizabeth used walnuts to create a brown dye that is used throughout the overtly somber, overall somber appearing quilt. And this quilt once again is characterized by 10 rows of alternating blocks of printed calico fabric, some with a paisley design and Lemoyne stars. We might speculate that Elizabeth used remnants of her family's clothing to create these blocks, or perhaps fabric that she secured from either her husband's store or a local merchant. Incorporating the clothing of a deceased loved one was common practice in quilt making and provided an intimate and lasting connection between the maker and the loved one who had passed. This quilt is distinguished from other mourning or memory quilts by the central image of the Mitchell family cemetery plot, which is bounded by a fence with obelisk-shaped posts and monument-style structures at each corner. Rural cemeteries really continued to evolve in the 1830s and a move away from public burial grounds toward more private plots of land and fences and elaborate entrance gates are thought to have ideologically, that is, separated the living world from the dead. Elizabeth was apparently aware of the symbology of mourning, for she skillfully incorporated the obelisk, which is the Egyptian symbol for the sun god Ra, who held the power to recreate, and it also represents eternal life and health. The archway symbolizes victory in life or death, and the gate may have represented the gates of heaven and passage into the afterlife. Elizabeth also skillfully embroidered willow branches and pink roses and rosebuds, which you can see here on the detail on your right, which have been known to represent both the death of the young and a confession of love. And some flowers are drooping from their stems, which point to lives cut short. Just give you a moment to look at these details. Most remarkable for mourning quilts, and perhaps one of the reasons that this quilt is so well known is because of the brown coffin-shaped pieces, which were made for each of the 13 members of the Mitchell family. Each of Shadrach and Elizabeth's children have a casket marked with a white slip of paper that were to be marked with the dates of their death. Some are marked and some are not. In the central cemetery section, we see the coffins of the first two sons who died, John Venata, and who died in 1836, and Bub, who died in 1843, and Elizabeth Mitchell Boyd, who died in 1869. And Elizabeth was one of the mother's daughters who helped to create the quilt. The fourth coffin that was moved to the central graveyard was for Elizabeth Roseberry Mitchell herself. And after she died, her daughters Sarah and Elizabeth continued to care for and alter the quilt, which may have been used as a bed covering. After Elizabeth's death in 1857, Sarah cared for the quilt until about 1870, and although she lived until 1911, Sarah stopped making alterations to the quilt before her father's death in 1875. Remarkably, in that center image particularly, we can see the design process of Elizabeth and her daughters in the outlines of the coffins in the central cemetery section. They marked spaces reserved for the 9 remaining members of the Mitchell's immediate family to be placed. The coffins of Shadrach, and you can see on the right image, the coffins of Shadrach labeled father, and that of a son, Roseberry, who died in 1903, flanked the entrance to the pathway leading to the central cemetery plot. And in this detail slide, we can see the delicate blossoms of pink flowers, which provide a visual contrast to the somber shades of black and brown that characterize the overall tone of the quilt. And you can barely see on the bottom of that image this bright, vibrant green border that surrounds the quilt that really mimics the green vines within the rest of the design of the quilt. The paper coffins on the top center and along the right top edge were created for the spouses of Elizabeth's children and even for grandchildren. It's very clear that prior to the days of Ancestry.com and findagrave.com, that Elizabeth Roseberry Mitchell intended for this quilt to serve as a family tree, a record and testament of the time that she and her family members spent together, no matter how brief. In 1959, at 92 years old, Nina Ora Nina Ara Mitchell Biggs, excuse me, whom I show you on the right. She was the granddaughter of Elizabeth Roseberry Mitchell, contacted the Kentucky Historical Society with her offer to donate this remarkable piece of her family history. In her letter to the Historical Society, she wrote, I suppose it is the only quilt of its kind in existence. As I am along in years, I have wondered where to place it. Is there such a place? Indeed, the graveyard quilt has remained one of the Historical Society in Kentucky's most treasured artifacts, not only because of the visual appeal of this remarkable textile, but also because of the remarkable and traceable history of its maker, who persevered through hardship and unimaginable grief to ensure that her family members would not be forgotten. And I will end here, but before I take questions, I just wanted to point to two publications. If anyone is interested in reading more about Kentucky quilts in general or the graveyard quilt, the book on the right, Kentucky Quilts and Quilt Makers, is a beautiful book, it quite recently published. And the publication on the right, Elizabeth Roseberry Mitchell's Graveyard Quilt, was written by the quilt maker's granddaughter and includes much more detailed genealogy of the family and of the descendants of her that are represented on the quilt. So thank you all very much.
There is a question.
Okay.
Julie Silber was wondering, are the signatures on the Eli Lilly quilt all in the same handwriting, or were they written by different hands?
That's a good question, and I can't remark upon that with 100% certainty, but it's my impression that they were signed by different family members who made the quilt. But that's certainly something that could be further researched.
That's the only other question I had in chat.
Jennifer, you might want to turn off your screen sharing then.
Okay. Let's see if I can do that quickly.
The group can assemble here and see each other. Yeah.
Yeah.
So,
I was excited to hear that I didn't realize you had an exhibit going on that you had accessible to you of 19th century mourning things, which ties in really great with this talk.
yes, it's a tremendous collection. We're very happy that we are. We do have access to it. It'll probably be on display at least this full year. We're coming into 2025 and into 2026. So if anyone from out of state wants to come see it, we'd love to have you come visit in the summer. And I'd say at this point, if someone wants to open up their microphone and offer Jennifer a greeting, you're welcome to do that.
Actually, we do have a couple more questions that just popped up.
Okay.
All right, let me get to them here. Okay, is all hair art considered mourning art?
That's a great question too. No, it is not. In fact, hair art was also made as expressions of love and friendship and passed between partners and friends, etc. So not always for use in mourning customs and practices.
And will the quilt ever travel to other museums for exhibit?
I don't believe we would ever have plans to do so at least we don't at this time. It's just so incredibly fragile that it stays with us at the Kentucky Historical Society. That said, we do welcome groups and individuals into our object storage to view the quilt, and we have done so regularly over the past number of years. We regularly are hosting people to come and see the quilt and more of our collections that we have on site.
Okay, and if I can get to this other one here. Is hair being incorporated into contemporary quilts?
That's a good, I'm not 100% sure. Anything's possible. I know there are a lot of wonderfully creative quilt makers operating today. I'm not familiar with any quilts that incorporate hair, but that's not to say they're not out there.
Yeah, I've never heard of it myself. Is Linda Otto Lipset the granddaughter of Elizabeth, and what is the age gap?
Yes, she is the daughter of a granddaughter of Elizabeth. And let's see, I, I couldn't say off the top of my head, but I have life and death dates around. If someone wants, I will shout out my email. If anyone wants to contact me after the talk, I'd be happy to, try to answer these questions when I have more of my source material and museum catalog records in front of me. And that's jennifer.downs@ky.gov.
Does the quilt remain on exhibit continuously?
It does not. It does not. In fact, I think the last time that it was on exhibit was about 5 years ago. I think we're hoping to change that soon, but it is kept in our storage facility, or climate, temperature, humidity controlled storage out of the harm of light. But when we do exhibit it, it will be for short periods of time. We typically rotate other quilts on display between about 4 to 6 months, just to preserve the fragility from environmental concerns, light levels, etc.
And another interesting question, are there any postcards that can be ordered with the quilt's image on them through your museum? And
Oh,
then I
I
wondered about a
wish.
link to your museum.
I wish, and I'm going to escalate that to our museum store manager. That's a wonderful idea, but we do not currently, so I'm sorry.
No. And would the quilt's fabric have been a combination of new and used fabric, or mostly repurposed fabric if fabric was too costly?
That's a good question. It could have been, I would suspect a little bit of both. There is some speculation that some clothing of family members was used in creating of the quilt, which was common practice. There is a bit of that paisley fabric throughout, that the calico fabric that may have been her husband. Elizabeth's husband was off and on a merchant, to my understanding. So it could have been that he had access to fabric through his shop, or his, what he was importing from the East Coast, or what was being made locally. So.
And then somebody had the comment that if you reproduce the paisley fabric, people will purchase it.
Yeah.
But it really isn't up to the museum to reproduce the paisley fabric. Actually, you could also Google Civil War reproduction prints, and you can get a lot of great prints like that look, vintage.
Sure. I love the paisley. It's one of those
Me too.
enduring patterns.
Me too.
Brenda, there's a question that was from Polly, and she asked, does a family cemetery exist? Could you answer that for us, Jennifer?
Not to my knowledge. Not to my knowledge. There could be some reference in Linda's Lipset's book, but it's not to my knowledge. There may have been at one time, but I can't speak with 100% certainty on that.
Thank you.
And there's also a suggestion about to have someone do a reproduction of the quilt. It would be an easy way to bring money into the museum gift shop.
Yes. Well, I think there have been quilt artists. If you Google it, I think there are some quilt artists out there who have endeavored to do so, and we're honored, certainly honored by that. I see someone raising their hand, Julie Ann. Hi.
I've made 2 t-shirt quilts for people who have passed away. Do you ever foresee, they're very popular right now, do you ever foresee a t-shirt quilt in your museum, or have you also seen these teddy bears made from, or stuffed animals made from the deceased, like a flannel shirt? Do you have any of those things on display in your museum, or do you ever anticipate receiving anything like that?
You know what? We have thousands of objects in our collection. I have no doubt that something similar may be hiding in our storage, but we do have over 220 quilts in our collection. And the t-shirt quilt is something that I have seen before, not quite sure in our collection, but I appreciate you mentioning that. But I haven't seen a bear, no.
No, okay.
I have a question. Has the quilt been stabilized in any way? Is there that fabric loss going on? And how are you storing it?
Yes, there is some fabric shattering of some fabric and deterioration that has happened. Right now, we have it stored in a flat storage drawer. A flat storage drawer within our museum object storage, which is it's in the dark, temperature controlled, very well tended to. So, Sue, I did see if I could make one correction to my email. I did see it pop up in the chat. It's
Yeah.
jennifer.downs@ky.gov.
Oh, okay. I will change that.
Anyone participating this evening that would like to listen to the recorded message again, just email me, director@cobblestonemuseum.org, and I'll be glad to send you the link. That was director@cobblestonemuseum.org.
Getting lots of praise on the presentation.
Oh, thank you. It was so great to
Yes.
join all of you tonight. Isn't that wonderful about Zoom that we can join one another from Kentucky to New York and everywhere in between?
Absolutely.
Exactly.
The
Well,
only good thing that came out of the COVID era was Zoom.
Right, right.
Well, I just want to take a few moments to just let some people know what's coming up next. We have 2 more virtual programs this season. Next month, in celebration of Black History Month, during the month of February, we have a program called Ulysses S. Grant and Civil Rights. And it highlights a very difficult but promising period of the civil rights struggle and Grant's role in it. Our speaker will be Ben Kemp, who is the operations manager at the U.S. Grant Cottage State Historic Site right here in New York State near Saratoga Springs. And registration is now open on our website. And in the month of March, in celebration of Women's History Month, Elizabeth Farrell from the Erie Canal Museum in Syracuse, New York, will discuss women and the Erie Canal. And she just sent me some new information today about the program. She said the program is going to talk about women in the suffrage movement prior to the completion of the Erie Canal and the difference that was made when the Erie Canal was completed to further their mission. So there are some very interesting programs and speakers that we have lined up. So if you like these types of programs, we would encourage you to watch our website for details about the March program. But right now you can go and register for February. I hope you're reading all of this praise that is coming in, Jennifer. So many people appreciate your discussion and these talks, and thank you. And if anyone has any suggestions about future topics or future quilt topics, please pass them on. Doug, did you have anything to add?
I think the upcoming significance of the Erie Canal program, Sue, is really wonderful, and that this is the 200th anniversary, the bicentennial of the opening of the Erie Canal. Is being celebrated in 2025, of course. And also here in Orleans County, where we're located, the Cobblestone Museum is in Orleans County, New York, we are celebrating the bicentennial of Orleans County as well. So a lot of activities this summer for the bicentennial will be taking place. So keep an eye on the Orleans County Bicentennial website as well.
Is there anyone else who would like to make a comment either in the chat or, as Doug suggested, you can open your microphone and make a comment?
Sue, I do want to, I'm looking at the comments in the chat. I may have misspoke. I think maybe Linda Otto Opset is the granddaughter of the donor of our quilt, Nina Mitchell Biggs. So I'm going to double check on that, and I'm going to let you know, and then we can clear that up.
I have two comments.
Yes.
I'm from Lewis, Delaware, and in Dover, Delaware, we have a big museum. I wonder if they're related.
I don't know.
So, also, one of the women who spoke mentioned a t-shirt quilt.
Yes.
And when I was teaching math at Bishop Ireton High School in Alexandria, Virginia, I made a t-shirt quilt with 12 of their homecoming t-shirts that were designed by the children. And teachers that had passed and several students that had passed, I put hearts on those t-shirts. They weren't squares, they were rectangles. And I didn't think of putting a casket. So, but I had put hearts. And all the teachers had to make something for the silent auction. So that was my contribution.
Thank you.
And just a PS, I am Sue's older sister.
Thank you.
Yes, I will forever be her little sister.
Yes.
So
Wonderful family reunion.
I did just kind of sort that out in my mind. So the quilt maker's granddaughter was the donor of the quilt, not the author of the book, but the donor of the quilt was the granddaughter of the quilt maker. So I hope I see Julie Silber in the chat. I don't know if she's still with us, but anyway, I just wanted to clear that up.
Well, thank you
Jennifer.
for clearing that up. And for me, let me clarify my earlier mistake. Her email address is jennifer.downs@ky.gov, and I did put it in to correct my faux pas. And if there's no other discussion about this program,
There
perhaps
is one quick question.
Okay.
Is Lipsit related?
Yes, she's related to the donor. She is related to the donor. Yes. The granddaughter of, I believe, the donor. Yes.
Thank you.
I'm just going to write this in the quilt here. Let's see.
Okay, as you're signing out, you're welcome to leave whenever you're ready. And if you want to unmute and say goodnight, you're welcome to.
Thank you and good night from New York.
Good night. Thank you.
Thank you and good night from Phoenix, Arizona.
Thank you.
Good night from LB, New York.
Good night from Lexington, Kentucky.
Oh, Kentucky, yay.
Good night from Williamsburg, Virginia.
And
Good
another
night.
good night from Lexington.
Oh, thank you.
Good night from Wisconsin.
Good night from the Eastern Shore, Maryland.
Good night, everyone, and thank you for joining us this evening.
Have a pleasant
Thank you,
evening.
everyone. Good night.
Hope to see you again in February.
Thank you.
Night.
So I'm going to sign out, Sue. You want me to leave it running so you can talk to your sister?
No, that's all right. I can talk with her anytime.
Okay.